Yep. Next. Paul Maynard to move the motion.
Disappointed to see so many colleagues leaving and not staying for my debate. I certainly can't understand it, and I thank the Minister for his time as well. It might be true to say the Blackpool Tramway needs no introduction from me. I'm sure many members who are leaving left Blackpool on it at some point as well, no doubt, after a party conference. It's been there now for well over 100 years, connecting Fleetwood in the north to Squires Gate in the south, linking the Pleasure Beach, the Tower, Cleveleys, Fleetwood, many of our major tourist attractions, attracted to 10 million visitors a year. The tram itself is a major reason for attending Blackpool and for visiting Blackpool. But it's worth pointing out to the Minister perhaps that actually the tram isn't just about tourism. It's actually also particularly beneficial for my constituents, the residents of the Fylde Coast. It's a major means for people to get to and from work in central Blackpool, where parking may be limited, where parking may be more expensive than utilising the tram. It's also particularly important for many of my elderly constituents who will use it to go into the town centres, to go shopping, and they will have actually chosen to live in this part of the world, particularly because of the access to the tramway. So that usefulness, the value of the trams, are coming under threat in my view for two particular reasons that I wish to cover today. And they both relate to the concessionary fare schemes in my view. We were very grateful that the previous Labour government before 2010 agreed to invest in upgrading the tramway to meet modern standards. As much as we all loved and cherished the antique heritage trams, many of which still trundle up and down to this day on weekends and during the holiday season, they were fast becoming not fit for purpose. There was a serious issue around accessibility and meeting modern accessibility standards. And it was right that we invested in improving them and bringing them up to date. And at that time, in 2012, when the new tramway was launched, when I travelled on the first new tram myself, it was a great day for the Fylde Coast. Blackpool Council took a brave and visionary decision, in my view, to ensure that, notwithstanding the national legislation regarding the concessionary fare scheme, anyone coming to Blackpool in possession of a concessionary card will be able to utilise it on the trams and travel anywhere on the tram network free of charge. That certainly helped ridership levels as the tramway came back into use and built up its ridership levels again. However, things are now changing. There has been an alteration in local government financing. We have to recognise that. Blackpool has decided it can no longer afford to make that generous offer to all residents of the UK. And that has had a major impact in my constituency, where residents of Cleveleys, which lies in Wyreborough Council, and which is immediately adjacent to the tracks, surrounded by houses on both sides, they must now pay full fare to travel on the tramway as it passes through Wyre, even though they may have a concessionary card. It's had a direct impact on the transport choices that they have to make, the decisions they have to make over where they go, what they do, and how they live. And that should be a concern. I entirely understand the perfectly rational argument that a particular transport authority should only be funding the concessionary fares for those residents who live within their area. I do not expect Blackpool to fund a national tram concession scheme that applies only to Blackpool. That, would be great if they did, but I entirely understand that they must work within their own budgetary limits, and they will come understandably under criticism from their own residents. They chose to be more generous than that. But it's worth pointing out that under the previous scheme, Lancashire County Council, which is a transport authority for the northern part of my constituency, was making a payment of £36,000 a year towards some of the concessionary travel of Lancashire residents on the tramway. And by removing that amount of spending, that was the trigger, in my view, for the overall deconstruction of what had been a perfectly simple and straightforward scheme that everybody understood. If they had a concessionary fare card, a now card as it's called in our part of the world, they could go anywhere on the tram. Everybody understood it. No one got caught out by it. And it's the removal of that is so, I think, pernicious to my constituency. And moreover than that, I think it's quite illogical. And if I can cite an example, a resident of Blackpool can travel between Cleveleys and Fleetwood on the tram, free of charge, at no point entering Blackpool territory, remaining wholly within Lancashire County Council territory, but still travelling free of charge on that tramway. However, any resident of Cleveleys seeking to go into Blackpool, to spend money in the local Blackpool economy, to travel there by tram, would need to pay full fare. There is a simple basic illogicality in that situation, which I know angers and frustrates so many of my local residents. And so, therefore, we need to, I think, try to think of what we can do to try to ameliorate the situation. And it's worth explaining a bit about the local geography, because people might think that because I am Blackpool North and Cleveleys, I am somehow two separate and distinct geographic areas. There's some belt to green belt running between Blackpool and Cleveleys that separates the two communities. Far from it. It is one solid, cohesive urban block. I have read somewhere that we are the most densely populated constituency outside of central London. I have very little green space apart from 1 or 2 golf courses on one farm. The boundary between Blackpool and Wyre is just a line on a map. It divides bedrooms, living rooms, greenhouses, back gardens. It goes through people's houses. So it is the ultimate postcode lottery. And there are many roads where residents on one side still have full and complete unfettered access to all of the tram network. On the other side of the road are hit by these changes. But there is this fundamental illogicality. And of even greater concern to me was the impact it had for disabled passengers in particular. One of the major reasons for upgrading the tram around the turn of the decade was disabled access. The platforms were raised at every station. The new trams had level access. New flexi trams were commissioned to make sure that they had level access, so wheelchairs had absolutely no problem getting on the trams. Blackpool has a valued reputation amongst disabled tourists as being somewhere they can go and know that they can get around easily because of the tram network. One of the consequences of Lancashire's decision to remove what limited concessionary fares that they provided for is that disabled passengers now cannot access the tram other than by paying full fare, and moreover can't be guaranteed that any other bus services that may be parallel will be accessible in turn. Although Blackpool Transport is certainly updating its fleet as fast as it can, there is no guarantee that one could stand at the bus stop and be confident the next bus to come along would be able to accommodate your wheelchair. So I would seriously ask the Minister to look at whether, in terms of how the network is constructed now and funded, whether they are complying with disability access rules, because that's a concern that I have. The solution to me is a relatively simple one. Blackpool should fund concessionary travel for Blackpool residents. Lancashire should fund concessionary travel for Wyre residents. I estimate the cost at being around £170,000. I've never been able to get a precise figure, much as I might like to, but that's what I've been told is a rough ballpark figure. Within the overall context of Lancashire's multi-billion-pound budget, that is not a significant amount of money. Though to you or I and many of my constituents, it is a sizable amount of money, I recognise. Now, to me, that's a very simple proposal. It shouldn't be difficult, in my view, to agree to. It's certainly not difficult to understand. Yet I can think of no issue which has been more controversial, argumentative, and indeed partisan over recent years than how we deal with this problem in our constituency. It was a major defining issue at the last election. And what I'm trying to do today is remove the partisanship from the debate. I'm not referring to the political control of each of these individual councils that are involved. And there are numerous arguments that people deploy against what I think is the correct solution. Many rightly point out, for example, that there's a parallel bus route to the tram network, the number 1 bus that goes just like the tram all the way from Fleetwood down to Squires Gate. And of course, there's an element of common sense in that. If you have to pay full fare for the tram, but you can use your concessionary card on the bus, why not get the bus? To me, you know, there's an element of common sense in that. However, there's a reason why the bus and the tram coexisted in the first place, and that was because of the level of demand. There's been no increase in bus provision on the route. As we've discussed earlier, there's been no change necessarily in each and every one of the buses that serve the number 1 route. And more importantly than that is the seasonal nature of demand on the number 1 route. There are numerous hotels lining the promenade, as anyone who's been to Blackpool will be able to see for themselves. When the bus, for example, number 1 bus stopped at the 480-bed Norbrett Castle Hotel, halfway between Cleveleys and Blackpool, a large number of those guests can want to get on the bus. Indeed, the queue can be dozens long, and that could then mean that when the bus gets nearer Blackpool, there's simply no room for anyone to get on the bus, even if the bus is accessible to wheelchairs. Further down into the town centre, there are more hotels on what's known as the cliff stretch of the promenade. Once again, the bus queues there develop rapidly, both to go north into Cleveleys and south into Blackpool. So the ability for people to be confident that they can access a bus service at peak hours is actually quite limited. And the expansion of the bus service would naturally require greater investment by both the transport authorities. Far better surely just to restore the concessionary travel scheme onto the trams where there is currently excess capacity. That to me would make far more sense in my view. The other argument that is often put, and which once again might sound plausible on first hearing, is if I was to want concessionary fare travel for Wyre residents, why shouldn't Wyre Council, the Borough Council, pay for it? And superficially, of course, that sounds eminently plausible. But of course, Wyre is not the Transport Authority. It's a very small Borough Council, one of I think about 16 within Lancashire. The impact of funding £172,000 for the concessionary fare scheme on Wyre's council tax level is, I have been told, roughly an increase of 3% for each and every taxpayer in the borough. That would be a considerable increase in my view. And because it is not the Transport Authority, I don't believe it has an obligation to meet that funding request anyway. There are many things at the moment that Lancashire is seeking to offload onto the boroughs. They're seeking to, for example, ban or stop the ferry from Fleetwood to North End and expecting someone else to pay for it. They're keen to get Wyre to part fund lollipop ladies. Wyre already part fund, for example, PCSOs in the area. So I think it would set a dangerous precedent to keep agreeing to fund everything the county council decided it no longer wanted to fund, yet it had an obligation to fund. So I'm not convinced by that argument myself either. Wyre taxpayers pay the bulk of their council tax to Lancashire County Council, the Transport Authority, which has the obligation to provide public transport, and it should meet that obligation. And this whole argument actually risks being overshadowed at the moment because Lancashire is going beyond just concessionary fare restrictions. It's going to stop paying, it argues, the maintenance for the tramway altogether, which would mean this whole debate is almost pointless because there will be no trams to Cleveleys or Fleetwood. They will turn round at the Little Bisping turning loop. They will not enter the territory of Wyre or Lancashire at all. And that would be devastating for towns such as Cleveleys and Fleetwood. Fleetwood in particular went through hell during the tram upgrade. The centre road of Fleetwood, Lord Street, was basically shut down during the tram upgrade work. Major impact on local businesses. To now have gone through all that, to have the tramway open for a couple of years and then see it cease again would, to my mind, simply not make sense at all. So I continue to be deeply concerned of what's going on with our tramways on the Fylde coast. I've held rallies in Cleveleys, launched petitions, made protests. I've had extensive talks with the department I know, and it would make my day if I could force the government's hand in some way and encourage them to extend the national regulations to include trams. And I make no apologies for asking once again for the Minister to do just that. And I live in hope, as I always do. And will the government at least look again at my 10-minute rule bill from a number of years ago to look at extending the concessionary fare scheme to community transport, as I know that they can take up some of the slack that has been created within the tram network, particularly for those disabled passengers who can't always access the bus travel. Additionally, I'd welcome the the Minister's views rather, on how it can help Lancashire to meet its public transport obligations. What assessment has he made of the human rights implications of Lancashire's various decisions, particularly in terms of disabled access? Would he be prepared to encourage Lancashire County Council further to discuss how devolution might allow it to find a way out of the problem which has created for itself? We have Transport for Lancashire, which no one is quite sure what it does, least of all Transport for Lancashire itself, I fear. We have the new Transport for the North, which I heartily welcome. The direction of devolution is towards giving greater control to local areas to craft their own solutions in terms of public transport. What help can the department give to these various bodies in Lancashire as they journey at varying rates towards a combined authority to find a solution that has a single common travel area for Lancashire, Blackpool and Blackburn? It makes no sense, as I discussed earlier, to have this arbitrary divide in postcode lottery. What advice can he offer the many thousands of my constituents in Cleveleys who have been left marooned because they simply can't access the trams without paying full fare and might not be able to afford full fare even? Would you agree with me that it's perverse for the county council to spend £150,000, almost the amount of 1 year's worth of concessionary fare travel, on looking at whether the tramway should be extended into Lytham St Anne's at the same time as trying to restrict concessionary fare travel? I have no objection to the tramway going to St Anne's. It's a lovely destination to go to. But what does that say about the priorities of the county council at the moment? What assessment has he made of the implications of these decisions and proposed decisions for the government's generous agreement to help fund the 16 million upgrade to extend the tramway in Blackpool town centre up to Blackpool North Station? With fewer riders, inevitably on the trams if all of this comes to pass, does it mean that we have to re-examine the business case for that proposal? And does it call it into question? I would be highly concerned if that were the case. Would welcome some reassurance from the Minister. And in the interest of time, so the Minister has a chance to reply, which I know he'll be keen to do, and I just stress once again that tramways might seem to be a peripheral issue in the bulk of constituencies. The tramway is literally at the heart of my constituency and the heart of our daily life. Without it, I find it hard to conceive of the Far Coast almost. At a time when the County Council is sitting on £400 million of reserves it cannot identify a specific use for, is it really prudent financial management to say that they can't afford to find £172,000 just to keep the concessionary fares going each year? It is artificially dividing my community. It's having a detrimental economic impact on the towns of both Cleveleys and Fleetwood. It's causing continued anger within my constituency. Can I look to the Minister for some positive words and some hope for the future that the accurate direction he's going in terms of transport devolution will lead towards this conundrum being solved as soon as we possibly can? Thank you very much.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turner. And may I start by congratulating my honourable friend on securing the debate today on concessionary fares in Blackpool North and Cleveleys. I think he's made his case with customary passion, and I was particularly struck by the importance of this issue on both visitors and on residents. I have some knowledge of the area, having visited his constituency on a number of occasions, and indeed taken in a former life company conferences to the Norbreck Castle Hotel, and very successful and enjoyable they have always been. He's raised a number of issues, so if I may, I'll start by responding to the specific issue on concessionary travel. Now, the government knows how important affordable, accessible transport is. It is absolutely the bread and butter of how many communities can move around and function, and that is, I think, especially true for older and disabled passengers. A point made, I thought, very clearly and powerfully in the Honourable Friend's speech. But that is, of course, why the government has committed to protecting the national bus travel concession in England and spends just around £950 million a year doing so. The concession provides much-needed help for some of the most vulnerable people in our society with greater freedom, independence and a lifeline to their community. It enables around 10 million older people and disabled people to access facilities in their local area and helps them keep in touch with family and friends and brings also wider benefits to the economy. The national concession sets a minimum standard available to any eligible person anywhere in England. But of course it doesn't come cheap, and that's why, that given the current economic situation, we do not have plans to extend the remit of the basic concession any further. My honourable friend asked if we could extend it into tramways. I will do some costing, but we don't just have tramways in his constituency, we have tramways growing as a feature of urban transport in our country, and they are successful. And we are seeing extensions to them in Nottingham, in Manchester, and in other areas too. They are popular, well used. Extending the concessionary fare scheme into our tramways would be, on a national basis, would be an extremely expensive undertaking. However, of course, local authorities do have the powers to enhance the offer, the national offer, with discretionary concessions according to local need and funding priorities. We'll come back to funding priorities at the end. Now, this may include extending the available times of the concession to include peak time travel, or offering a companion pass for people who need assistance to travel, or offering concessions on different modes of transport, such as trams. And as we've heard, it can also include concessionary arrangements between neighbouring local authorities, such as the one between Blackpool Borough Council and Lancashire County Council, to accept of now cards and from other Lancashire residents on the Blackpool tramway. Now, I'm aware of the changes to the administration of this enhancement, and however I can really understand both my honourable friend's disappointment and his constituents' disappointment. The provision of such discretionary concessions is a matter for local authorities to work together to try to solve these problems, based upon their assessment of local need and funding priorities. Now, trams and light rail are a convenient, regular, reliable way for people to get to work, to school, or to travel around their area with ease. Well-planned systems in the right location can enhance the reputation and ambience of an area. However, I don't think it is for the government to dictate what extensions should be made to particular schemes, as these decisions should be taken locally to reflect the individual needs and circumstances of an area. That is entirely in the grain of government thinking about devolution and people taking responsibility and ownership for their areas, and making sure that we make decisions in our country as near as possible to where a service is delivered. Consequently, that service will be better tailored to local need and therefore a better service. Now, on the joint funding arrangements between Blackpool District Council and Lancashire County Council for tramway maintenance, I understand discussions may already be taking place, and I don't wish to preempt any outcome, but it's my sincere hope that a speedy and satisfactory resolution can be reached, which will have the best interests of the community at heart. It might just be worth spending a moment to consider funding for rural services, because we've had many requests for further support for transport in rural areas. We have had calls to government to provide a dedicated fund to maintain and improve bus services in rural areas. I'd just like to assure the House that we fully recognise the extra pressure placed on local authorities to provide services in more isolated areas. If communities get disconnected from transport, they can wither and die. So transport is fundamental to community health. And that's why we have introduced the Rural Services Delivery Grant, which is a non-ring-fenced grant paid to the most rural councils. Last year, the government added £2 million of additional funding to the £9.5 million in the Rural Services Delivery Grant already provided. And I'm sure we all welcome the recent announcement made by my right honourable colleague, the Minister for Local Government, that he intends to increase the support for the most sparsely populated rural areas by quadrupling the Rural Services Delivery Grant from £15.5 million to £65 million in 2019-20. But of course, transport in rural areas is not just about the levels of public funding, it's about how and where that funding is used. Where commercial operations are not feasible, local authorities have a vital role in supporting rural bus services. Indeed, around a fifth of bus mileage in predominantly rural areas is operated under contract to the local authority. We believe that local authorities are best placed to decide what support to provide in response to local need. That's why we have devolved £40 million of the £250 million paid in the BSOG bus subsidy to councils outside London last year to support bus services in England, again, so that they can decide for themselves how it is spent. But it is vital that those local authorities maximise the return on every penny of the funding they provide. Happily.
Would he recognise that many urban bus services in the centre of Blackpool actually originate in rural areas, and the proposals by Lancashire County Council to reduce rural bus subsidies will actually also reduce the frequency of bus services within central Blackpool? So it's actually not just about rural-urban, because many rural bus services also support urban areas.
Well, my honourable friend makes a valuable point, and I entirely agree with that point. The distinctions are very blurred, and both clearly have a knock-on effect upon each other. I'd just like to spend a moment highlighting an initiative called Total Transport. You know, at present, around £2 billion of public funding every year is used on transport services provided by a number of different agencies. You know, for example, I mentioned the Bus Service Operators Grant, 250 million, local bus services through DCLG, 317 million, Home to School Transport, DCLG, it's a further billion, non-emergency patient services, 150 million, that's provided to the NHS by local individual clinical commissioning groups. All this funding provided from different sources. That's why last year we launched a £7.6 million total transport pilot scheme across England to explore how the different authorities working together can potentially deliver a much better transport solution. It is about working collectively and having pooling budgets where there is common interest. We are seeking to avoid duplication of commissioned services, allowing networks to be designed to complement each other, to reduce administrative costs, and also focus very much upon how a much more comprehensive offer can be delivered by working together. My honourable friend mentioned community transport. Community transport, I think, is fundamental in many parts of our country, both urban and rural. I hope he is aware that we have strong support for this. We have indeed supported it with a recent community minibus fund, which is a £25 million budget. That funding will help elderly residents through provision of, I think, 310 new minibuses, 2 groups up and down our country. So far, £1.3 million of grant has been paid to organisations to buy their vehicles, and the procurement for all the remaining vehicles is well underway. So this will make a difference to the whole sector. Of the specific issues that were raised, I will most certainly write to the councils concerned, because I think the point here is partnership solution to deliver a result for residents. I will highlight to the councils the strength of feeling that is shown in this debate, urge them to work together. The solution has to lie in councils working in a non-partisan way. I will ask in my letter to Lancashire County Council that they consider the impact of changes on disabled people particularly. That is an area I know of personal interest to my honourable friend. It is also an area of significant personal interest to me, and I do not want to see any area where disability access to our public transport system is compromised. I want to see it improve, not the opposite. I hope that the message from our council that goes from here to these councils is that we want to see a solution which will continue to offer tramway access and support Blackpool's trams. They are an iconic part of Blackpool. If you are a visitor to Blackpool, one of the reasons you go is to visit the trams, particularly at certain times of the year. That is something I have experienced as a visitor to Blackpool, and that point as a driver of the local economy must also be understood. So there is an economic and a social reason why a swift resolution would be very helpful. That is the message that I will be sending to the councils, and of course when I hear back from them I will report back to my honourable friend. but they will, I'm sure, be acutely aware of the strong case he has made and continues to make.
The question is that this House has considered concessionary fares in Blackpool North and Cleveleys. As many are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until